Well, hey folks, this is Paul Horton working with the Athena Group to support the Lacey's community work group on homelessness. And uh, we have some next steps homework for you, and that is to help us evolve and review and improve the current list of possible principles and goals. For those of you that did not participate in the meeting last night, December 1st. We're sorry we missed you, and we wanted to give these instructions to you so that you could get up to speed on what we're doing. And I also wanted to provide this to the folks that were there last night, because often there's confusion about what we're about, what we're trying to do, and what's the best way to go about it. So I prepared this little presentation, short video to help us so that we're all working from the same sheet of music, hopefully. And I'll talk a little bit more about the homework at the very end, but for now you have until Friday after next. What is that? I can't remember what that is, but I'll get to that to complete your homework. But to start out with, just worth noting that obviously we all know that homelessness is a complex challenge, very complex challenge, and a common challenge that we see when we're faced with working with complex issues like this is that we have many individuals and different organizations that have interests or stakes in the issue, and they often tend to have very different understandings of the nature of the problem, often even including where to draw the boundaries of the problem or what possible solutions might be. And to that, people often have their own definition of success in mind. For some, in this case, it might be more housing. Some it might mean, we need to, the strong continuum of care is how we define success. Success might mean getting people off the streets by any means, or having stronger police presence, or, success might mean for some putting more resources into upstream approaches. So it's very easy for people to have these different views, and so it's hard to come together. And then also, correspondingly, it's very different. People often have very different ideas of what strategies and actions should be implemented. And so it can take months or years for groups groups of diverse individuals to agree on detailed definitions of both the problem and what success would look like. And by the time they finally do, the problem and even the players involved might even change substantially. But the fact is that no one person or organization knows enough to fully understand and address the complex challenge of homelessness on their own, because these kinds of challenges are characterized by high levels of change or uncertainty and disagreement. And this leads to debate, confusion, and frustration. And in the face of this, what you see is that people often will tend to focus harder and harder on their own areas of specialization, that we sometimes call those their drill holes, or their own, biases or political persuasions or whatever that is. And I'm not saying we're all doing this, but it's just a very natural tendency for individuals to do this in the face of lots of change and uncertainty. And that's the problem with that is it can lead to sometimes intractable arguments over details. And ultimately we get more fragmentation, more confusion, we get sub-optimized measures and results. And not enough integration to address the problem from what we call a system perspective. And one way to think about this is like there's a lot of chattering away in the twigs and the leaves while the branches and trunk of the tree are slowly withering. And so it's very, very easy for groups of people to fall into these kinds of patterns and get lost in the twigs and the leaves. And one term we have for this is reductionism. Here's an image that depicts reductionist approach to thinking and planning. So if you have overly detailed definitions of problems and definitions of success in a complex system, that can be problematic because we find ourselves getting lost in disagreements. So given that, how do we move forward? First of all, we need to make sure that we're taking a systems approach, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And one important way that we can do that is by identifying and agreeing on principles. I'll talk about that for a little bit. So some of the benefits of taking a principle-based approach is that they emphasize the following things. A principle-based approach can help diverse groups of people with all their different views and biases and histories and perspectives, all their important knowledge, and you can better focus it, and we can focus it upstream in the cause and effect chain. And so we're not getting lost in the leaves and the twigs too much. So rather than focusing overly much on addressing problems where it's just so much more complex downstream. It also focuses on principles that we can all agree on rather than the details, which are easily debated. And it provides a shared framework and a common language to better support decision making. So there are some real good benefits for principle-based approach to thinking and planning. And if done correctly, this can help us achieve all of the above, while also leaving enough room for multiple paths forward and the agility for navigating the unexpected. So one example of a complex system that relies on first order principles, there are many that we can think of if we want, is a game of chess. If you think of a game of chess from a systems perspective, firstly, at what we call there are certainly many different strategies, moves, and skills necessary to become a good player, right? And they're, of course, very critical. However, the two opponents could never achieve anything together without first agreeing on the basic objectives and rules of the game. We can think of these as principles, if you will, or sometimes we talk about them as boundary conditions. These are sort of non-negotiables, principles of the game of chess, right? You can't just move your rook any way you want it. There are certain agreements about how we do that. So those are sort of what we call boundary conditions. The board is sort of part of our boundary. The different players are sort of part of the system of the chess game. So we agree on those rules just as we do a soccer game or what have you. And so a bunch of different people with all their different views and ideas and expertise can come together and collaborate now because they've agreed on these basic boundary conditions or basic principles. So once you do that, there's a ton of freedom, tremendous freedom to pursue multiple options to get to a broadly defined definition of success, whatever that might be. So, in this case, success is capturing the king and achieving checkmate. You can see that we have a strategic level. That's what are the strategies we're going to use to sort of achieve our definition of success. And then there's actions. Any actions you might take, or investments you might make to move you in the direction that you want to go. One of the things you see quite often when we're trying to work together to develop plans with people is people quickly run to solutions and actions. And by taking a systems approach, this helps us to sort of like make sure that the actions that we're choosing, the investments we're making in programmatically or what have you, are the right things that are leading us in the direction we want to go. And because there's so many different actions we can obviously take, right? So overall, this idea is referred to as simplicity without reductionism. And the idea here is to make it simpler to deal with all the complexity without disregarding it, for that altogether. It just makes it easier for people to collaborate and to coordinate the various parts and perspectives, right? And it's easier for us to look upstream in the cause and effect chain. And so, these are some benefits of doing this approach here. So here's some critical questions at the system level. Is what is the system in question? What are the system boundaries? We can have a conversation about that. City of Lacey, regional, how do we define boundaries there? Another question is like what non-negotiable principles of this system exist? How do we define this system? And also, just so you know, that sometimes we refer to these principles as first order principles. And I'm making a pretty clear distinction here between simply broad statements of values, or oftentimes you see principles listed and they sound just like platitudes, and principles that are more useful, that actually help us as we move forward. So when we say first order principles or boundary conditions, that's kind of different than, say, a value statement or just some kind of a platitude. So here's an example I want to give you. This is from a plan I helped the Everett Housing Authority develop their 5-year strategic plan. And these are the first order principles they developed, the boundary conditions. And they're saying effectively, there's a million things they could do, right? There's so many things they could do, but they decided that whatever they choose to do, any future decisions or actions they make can't violate these principles. They can't limit people's potential. They can't further concentrate poverty, because you find out that some investments housing agencies make actually, counterintuitively do that. They can't independently decide what's best for their residents. Pardon me for the phone. So you see how this works. And so another statement that they have in their plan is if we continue to operate while violating these following non-negotiables, or these first order principles, we're not going to consider them. And here's another way to look at that, right? So it's simple. It's really simple. How do you operationalize it at one level? Is this decision or this action or this investment in alignment with these principles? Yes or no? If it's in alignment, well, good, we're heading in the right direction. If it's not, it doesn't necessarily mean we can't do the thing that we need to just pay attention to. What are things that we need to pay attention to so that over time we reduce that we no longer are violating this principle, that we're in alignment with. I hope this makes sense. So that's kind of principles. And this is hopefully this is a little bit more of a helpful way to think about principles so that we're all operating from the same playbook. We're all thinking about it in the same way, a shared common language. And so we're not just talking about value statements or just platitudes. We have a specific idea in mind of how these principles will be useful for us. Now let's move to the success level. Remember in our 5-level model with the chess thing, systems perspective, once we've defined the system and what are maybe some principles that sort of bound it, how do we define success? This is also where goals come into play, but I want to emphasize that when we're talking about success, what we're hoping to look at is like, we want to get out of our sense of what's possible in the current moment, and we're thinking a little bit more long term, at a minimum 5 years, maybe 10 years. And we're saying, what would it look like? What would it feel like for us to be 100% successful in everything we do? What would that look like? How do we know we've achieved success? And so we also talk about these as strategic long-range goals. You might have heard the term BHAGs before, big, hairy, audacious goals. The idea is that we know we can't achieve this today, but it's going to stretch our sense of what's possible. And by doing so, it is going to help us all strive together to work toward a higher level goal than we would have otherwise. If we set low level goals that are not hard to achieve, we'll achieve less. If we stretch ourselves, we're likely to achieve more. We may not achieve those goals in 5 years. And if we're honest and transparent about it, that's okay. But the idea is we're aspiring toward these higher level goals. So just another way to think about this, let's say we've established some core values, and this is a mountain. Our goal is to climb and get to the top of that mountain. And maybe for us and Lacey, the vision of the highest level of pinnacle of success is, we've ended homelessness, or maybe that's just too audacious and that's ridiculous and we can't think that way. But maybe it's something like we've made homelessness a very rare thing and it's temporary. So we've really made a big impact on it. The idea is the vision is the top of the mountain. The strategic long-range goals are key milestones on your way up to the pinnacle. It's like our base camps. That's another way to think about that. So how do we know a goal is actually strategic? So you're going to be asked to provide input on the goals as well as some draft principles. So here's some ways to think about it. When you look at a goal and you're evaluating it, is it clear? Yes, it should be clear. If it's not clearly worded, it's too vague, it's confusing, it's not helpful. Is it compelling? Does it stretch your sense of what's currently considered possible so that you feel like, wow, if we were able to achieve that, that would be worth our time and effort, even though it may be hard to get there, right? Does it describe a clear finish line or direction in terms of how you know when you've actually achieved it? So you see a lot of goals that are just like, we're going to increase this, we're going to be better there. So it should provide a clear finish line. If the goal is achievable in 1 to 3 years, or maybe even 5 years, I should say 5 years there, then it's probably not a BHAG. It's not a big, hairy, audacious goal. It's not going to stretch you, right? And then finally, does it describe strongly a particular solution? If it does, it's probably too specific. The idea being it's closing off your pathways, right? Because the world is changing. We learn as we go, things we didn't know along the way. And so you need to be nimble and flexible. So your goal should also not be too specific. So it's an interesting challenge to find one that's both defines a clear finish line, but is not too specific. As I say, we don't want it to be too vague. Just saying increasing or improving or growing or being better at, just being better isn't specific enough. So it's not helpful. here are some things that came out of the recent conversations and work with our different work groups that were listening and gathering input. These, to me, all look like strategies. They look like potential actions that we could take on our way towards something, towards some goal. They're too specific, right? So they don't show up at the goal level. So just I've saved these in a separate document as potential future strategies or actions, and hopefully that makes sense. So they're things that show up at the actions level. So I'm going to give you just some examples of some strategic long-range goals of some organizations I've worked with, just to sort of, tune up our thinking a little bit. Here, Everett again, Housing Authority, their 5-year strategic plan. There's some interesting stuff here. We're going to double our stock of housing and maximize new vouchers. So you could quibble with any one of these, but the idea is these seem pretty specific. They are going to stretch the Everett Housing Authority for sure. They're audacious goals, and they're not too specific, because there's a million ways they could try to achieve these things, or different pathways they could take to try to get there. Direct 100% of our resources toward creating diverse, healthy communities of opportunity. Communities of opportunity is a term of use, and it says that we're not going to develop housing strategies that don't conform to this. We're going to ensure that our commitment to the diversity, equity, inclusion, and undoing institutional racism has created equity for our staff, people we serve. So that means this has real implications, big stretch goals, implications for what they choose to do and how they focus their energy and their resources going forward. Here's the Mason Transit Authority. There's some interesting stuff here. They're going to coordinate their existing and new funding streams and provide seamless service. All riders, funders, planners, and providers are actively working together. So this is kind of a collaboration goal, which is kind of interesting and important. Riders schedule, pay for, and access transportation services in one place. When we started doing this plan together, they absolutely was totally fragmented. It was a complete bewildering mess for the rider. And so this is a very audacious goal. It has there's some barriers to achieving it currently, but the idea is now they've set their sights on breaking through that barrier. Similarly, the Pierce County Coordinated Transportation Coalition, when they looked across their geography, they found there were all these transportation gaps. There are areas where people just cannot find rides to get where they need to go. So they set a very audacious goal. They only have 3 goals. We're going to close these gaps. We're going to connect our system, very similar to what the Mason Transit Authority was saying. We're going to make everything seamless. And then we're going to make sure that no one in the community doesn't know that our services exist and how to access them. And just to go a little farther into this, and I'm sure this makes logical sense. This is the goal: connect the system you just saw. And here are just some of the strategies they came up with to help them move toward that. We're going to very specific. Now, remember when I showed you some examples of too specific things that really look more like actions or strategies. That's what I mean here. Develop service agreements and partnerships for collaboration. So that means these are some of the things that are going to really big strategy areas that they're going to emphasize as they move toward this particular goal. Here's another one: Seattle City Employees Retirement System. I probably won't dwell on this here, and some of and then they have measurable objectives. So they've got key strategies. They've got 6 strategies, and then they've got a series of more interim, near-term measurable objectives on their way toward achieving those. So what is your homework? The idea here is that by no later than the end of the day, Friday, December 11th, so it is today, Wednesday, and this Friday is, I think, whatever. So you got about a week and a half. What we're asking you to do is the following. We want you to review the list of possible principles and the possible goals that we're going to provide you separately. You'll see this in an email along with this video recording. And we want you to add your questions and your concerns and your proposed changes to them. We want you to track changes in the document so that we can see what you're including. So if something seems too vague, if something concerns you, if you have an entirely new goal or a change to a goal, the idea is we're collectively evolving these, and we're going to do this over time. All right. So what you have here are not set in stone. They're not, maybe we're not even going to call them draft principles and goals. They're really just possible ones. And where these have come from is they have emerged from our various listening sessions with people, particularly through these work groups. And they represent just our best effort to try and capture what we heard from the different work groups, the data group, from the community cafe with the Lacey residents, and from the stories and interviews from the 3 groups of unhoused persons. So once you provide your input, we'll then revise them again, and we'll have a tighter, more coherent version of possible principles and goals. And then we'll go out and get more feedback on those. They'll be shared with others in the community for their input. And the idea here is that, of course, ultimately the work group is going to recommend a set of final goals and strategies and principles. But that said, the idea is to develop a plan that's responsive to the community, and while also being informed by expert understanding of homelessness generally and of specific approaches, services, and needs. And if this is going to have any traction as a plan, it's going to have to be owned by the community. So it's important that we listen intently to all the perspectives, find a way forward that addresses what matters most to people across their differences. Also we're going to have to keep the focus on people with a lived experience, what they say and what will help them best. So, there are a lot of expertise in this work group, but there's a lot of expertise in the community, a lot of knowledge, a lot of firsthand knowledge, and also we need their buy-in and ownership over this plan, especially other NGOs, the faith community, because it's not just Lacey's plan, it's the community's plan. So I hope this is helpful. If you have any questions in the meantime, you can email me at paulh@athenaplace.com. There's my phone number. And I look forward to receiving your input. All right, thanks, folks.